It's a dark, brooding portrait, very a silhouette. Half my face is shown, me holding a paintbrush, and you look into my eye, and in that eye you see the despair, the agony of being in prison. One night in 1988, I was sitting in my cell. I picked up a mirror, I looked in the mirror, I saw an individual going to spend the most productive years of his life in a cage. Picked up a canvas, painted the self-portrait entitled 15 to Life, and then 7 years later wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Well, I was no drug kingpin, I was a peon. I never saw a kingpin in my life in prison. Only low-level, nonviolent drug offenders that were juggling drugs to feed their families. In 1973, these laws were enacted. The legislative intent was to curb the drug epidemic and capture the drug kingpin. Governor Rockefeller at the time had presidential aspirations, and he wanted to look tough on crime, so he created the toughest laws in the nation that mandated mandatory minimum sentencing. The greatest thing about going to prison, the experience, was the discovery of my political awareness, who I was and where I am today, where I sit in society. That's why I'm an activist. That's why I do what I do. I try to save people's lives.
Mandatory minimums for low-level nonviolent drug offenses. Well, for more, we're joined by two guests in New York. Anthony Pappas, author of This Side of Freedom, Life After Clemency. He's an anti-drug war activist, painter, and author. In 1985, Anthony Pappas agreed to deliver an envelope of cocaine in a police sting operation in return for $500. His first and only criminal offense cost him a 15-year-to-life sentence. In 1996, Pappas won a sentence commutation from then-New York Governor George Pataki. In 2016, Pappas received a pardon from New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. He's believed to be the first person in New York State history to receive both a sentence commutation and a pardon.
My name is Anthony Pappas. In 1985, I made the biggest mistake of my life, got involved with drug activity. And when you do stupid things when you're desperate. The mindset in the 80s when I got arrested was people feared the drug war. Politicians especially created these strict Rockefeller drug laws. The legislative intent was to capture the drug kingpin and to stop the drug epidemic. And what it did really was arrest low-level nonviolent drug offenders like myself and flooded the prisons with these individuals, 94% black and Latinos. The first day of prison was a living nightmare. Sing Sing was full of violence and drugs. If you had money, get any type of drug you wanted in Sing Sing. If you can't control drugs in a maximum security prison, how can you control drug use in a free society? The way I survived the prison was my discovery of art. It helped me maintain my humanity. It helped me transcend the negativity of imprisonment. I looked in the mirror. I saw an individual who's going to spend the most productive years of his life in a cage. I picked up a canvas and I painted the self-portrait, 15 Years to Life. It was exhibited years later at the Whitney Museum of American Art. It created this energy, this sort of urge to be a painter. And that's when I started painting day and night. I painted hundreds and hundreds of paintings, and that's how I got a lot of publicity on my case. It reached the ears of Governor George Pataki, who then, a couple of years later, granted me executive clemency. I literally painted my way to freedom. I think the problem with society is they tend to think only of the punishment part of being in prison, not the rehabilitative part. Well, the war on drugs under the Obama administration definitely has improved. We have been so lucky, but now we are in fear of what's going to happen with President Trump coming in, especially with this new Attorney General Jeff Sessions. With Trump in office and his whole administration, I think it's going to be a throwback to the 80s again. Prison does not end at the prison wall. It goes beyond the wall. It affects the loved ones of individuals. Prison breaks families up and ruins relationships. Individuals do make mistakes and they need second chances in their lives. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people locked up for nonviolent drug offenses. Prison should be re-socialization centers. It's not. If you go to prison like myself, a 15-year life sentence, you're lucky to come out with all your marbles. Prison destroys people.
Federal prosecutors have been ordered to pursue the toughest possible sentences for criminal suspects. U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions issued a memo May 10th rolling back Obama-era reforms that eased sentencing for some nonviolent drug offenders. Anthony Pappas is the manager of media and artist relations for the Drug Policy Alliance. Pappas says Sessions' reinstatement of harsher sentencing policies will destroy families because the breadwinners will be locked up for extensive periods of time.
Not only is it going to put people with drug problems away that should be treated medically, not punitively, he's going to affect many family members of those that are being incarcerated.
The National Association of Assistant United States Attorneys says the policy will, quote, restore the tools that Congress intended to punish drug suspects. For United News International, I'm Neela Uni.
Well, less than a month after calling New York City soft on crime, Attorney General Jeff Sessions was presented with an award from the NYPD Sergeants Union today.
Okay, it's there that he announced his new policy to crack down on drug offenses. Here's Jen Lammers.
Throwing the book at our nation's drug offenders in a dramatic reversal of Obama-era policy, Attorney General Jeff Sessions demanding federal prosecutors ask for maximum sentences on drug crimes.
I have given our prosecutors discretion to avoid sentences that would result in an injustice. This is a key part of President Trump's promise to keep America safe.
Sessions detailing a memo he sent to U.S. attorneys which also sets mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders. While supporters say the new policy is aimed not at low-level offenders, but at drug traffickers and dealers.
These are the kind of people we want to keep off the street. This is something that President Trump takes very seriously, and certainly Attorney General Sessions. And I'm happy that we're finally going to go after people who are trafficking the most dangerous narcotics that are plaguing not only Staten Island, but everywhere in New York City, if not the country.
Critics argue it would only add to an overloaded prison system. Former Attorney General Eric Holder, who led drug policy reform in 2013 by directing prosecutors to look at circumstances before charging defendants with drug crimes, calls the move dumb on crime and ill-informed. Anthony Pappas agrees. He served 12 years in prison for a non-violent drug offense before then-Governor George Pataki granted him clemency.
They tried that in New York with the Rockefeller drug laws. When the laws were enacted in 1973, it was to capture the drug kingpin and to curb the drug epidemic. It did neither. It locked up low-level, nonviolent drug offenders, where our prisons in New York burst at its seams.
Several other critics, Charles and David Koch, who today came out opposing the plan, saying a more effective measure would be to change existing federal laws. Reporting from the newsroom, Jennifer Lammers, Fox 5 News.
There aren't a lot of artists with works owned by the Whitney Museum of American Art and who also served a dozen years in prison. But that distinction can be claimed by Anthony Pappas, who got out of jail almost 2 decades ago after some real struggles, and today is a renowned and successful painter. Right now, he and some fellow artists are getting ready to present a new show titled The Museum of the War on Drugs at the United Nations, no less.
And he's an author, too. His latest book is called This Side of Freedom, Life After Clemency. And no, we're not finished. Mr. Pappas is also the manager of media and artist relations at the Drug Policy Alliance. Tony Pappas, welcome to BK Live.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us.
So you spent a dozen years behind bars, and now you're working against those drug policies that kept you there for that long. How did that marriage come together?
Well, when I received clemency from Governor George Pataki in 1994, so when I came out after serving a sentence of 12 years in the maximum security prison, Sing Sing, I wanted to save those I left behind. So I started this personal agenda to paint images of those in prison as humanistic, which is rarely done. So I went on a rescue mission, bottom line, to save those I left behind.
Tony, did you paint before?
No, I discovered my talent in prison. On one day I was sitting in my cell after 3 years. picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror, saw an individual who's going to spend the most productive years of life in a cage, and I picked up a canvas and I painted this self-portrait titled 15 to Life. 7 years later, it wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art. I got a lot of publicity on my case, and that's how I got granted executive clemency. But I discovered my talent in prison. And it's one night I was smelling this turpentine, and I followed the scent to the cell, and there was another a painter in the cell painting, and he had portraits that looked like Rembrandt, and I couldn't believe it. So he turned around, he came out, and one of the rules in prison I didn't know is that you don't look in somebody's cell. It's a sign of disrespect, and that's high on the level of existence in prison. And he wanted to fight with me, so I calmed him down. I told him, look, I admire your work. I think you're great. So then he had like a big head, and he said, oh, have you ever painted before? I said, no. He said, do you want to try? I said, yeah. So he gave me some watercolor, some paper, and I went in my cell overnight, painted the worst painting you ever saw, but it ignited this fire, desire to create. And that's how I became a painter.
Tony, we're seeing some stills here of some of your work. If you could tell us about some of these.
Yeah, this is all work that you see now was done while I was in prison. And basically, I talked about the experience. If you want to take a view of what a prison experience is about, you can go to my website, 15tolife.com, and see these images I made. And one of the greatest things about my discovery of my art in prison is discovering also who I was and where I sat in society. I discovered my political awareness in prison. I actually went to prison. I got 3 degrees when I went to prison. I got a master's degree from New York Theological Seminary, and I started creating these images where I feel an artist should be a social commentator, talk about the issues that affect us all. So for these paintings that you see now, these were images that I created in prison that talked about the reality that surrounded me.
So for me, 2 ironies come to mind. Number one, that you felt that sense when those bars closed that I'm going to spend the most productive years of my life in Sing Sing. And you also, at the same time, found what could be your life's mission, bringing this art as your commentary politically. And the second is that you guys are opening at the UN about the war on drugs and having all of these images and getting political with a body that doesn't have the best record when it comes to the war on drugs.
Right. Basically, what's going to happen April 19th to 21 is the show. But that week, there's going to be a bunch of stuff going on in the United Nations. The Global Commission is going to be there. And these are former heads of governments, former presidents, talking about the global war on drugs. It not only affects Americans, it's around the world. Drug users today are stigmatized. They're like communists in the McCarthy era. People are thrown away in cages, over 1 million in the federal government, New York State, 55,000. 94% were black and Latinos in New York State, very racist laws. So these laws exist. It's still going on. President Obama now is initiating legislation to try to fix a broken criminal justice system. Mandatory minimum sentencing, crack cocaine disparity. These are all problems and issues that affected the United States of America, which actually broken the criminal justice system. So we're trying to fix it. My organization I work for, Drug Policy Alliance, is the biggest advocacy organization in the United States, and we, seek to fix laws that are like these laws, mandatory minimum sentencing laws, that just are horrible. Somebody could go to prison for $10 worth of cocaine for 10 years, 15 years. So we're trying to fix those laws, and we're trying to say, if somebody puts some substance in their body, they shouldn't be penalized criminally. I think drug addiction is a medical problem, not a criminal problem, but the way it's being treated is criminally.
Tony, what can we expect to see at the museum?
Well, you're going to have art installations by other artists. Some of my paintings will be there. The painting on display now is my famous painting, 15 to Life, which was at the Whitney Museum, displayed, showing the reality, the despair of spending a significant time of your life in a maximum security prison. So you're going to see images. There's going to be actually cells built, just paintings and just objects that reflect the reality of the war on drugs at the art exhibit.
So leaving Sing Sing, how do you begin to navigate the art world? You talked about some of the personalities inside, and I can only imagine some of the personalities outside dealing with those.
It has not been easy.
Yeah.
But you know what I do is I show my work a lot of spaces, cultural spaces around leading galleries, wherever I could. My objective is not really to sell my art. But it was nice to sell a piece, but to get the word out about the war on drugs and what it means for people to be imprisoned for small amounts of drugs and get whacked with tremendous sentences. So my art goes along with my advocacy for telling people what the drug war is about and who it affects.
Right, what it actually does, what it actually looks like, and humanizes it. Tony, there's also the book coming out, right? So it's already available as an e-reader. It comes out next week in print. This Side of Freedom, Life After Clemency. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's another memoir. My first memoir was 15 to Life, How I Painted My Way to Freedom. Feral House. That was published in 2004, and that was about my prison experience. This book is a book about my 18 years of freedom and how I've done what I've done to survive, because almost 70% of those that come out return within 3 years. So my whole objective is to talk about my experience and to show how I survived outside and was one of the few that made it and created, you know, who I am today. Tony Pappas, the artist, the author.
Well, Tony Pappas, the artist, the author, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thanks so much.
Bringing your work by. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
This afternoon, the Senate Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing on what's being called the most historic criminal justice reform proposal in decades. The measure would reduce mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenders while also increasing mandatory minimum sentences for other offenses, including interstate domestic violence. It would also ban solitary confinement for juveniles and bolster rehab programs for some inmates. The hearing comes amid growing momentum for sweeping criminal justice reform, including a major push by President Obama, who touted the Senate bill during his weekly address.
And I'm encouraged by these kinds of bipartisan efforts. It's real progress. Not liberal ideas or conservative ideas, but common sense solutions to the challenges we face. We pledge allegiance to one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all. Justice means that every child deserves a chance to grow up safe and secure without the threat of violence. Justice means that the punishment should fit the crime. And justice means allowing our fellow Americans who've made mistakes to pay their debt to society.
Well, the bill is being backed by key leaders on both parties, and a similar measure is also making its way through the House. MSNBC chief legal correspondent Ari Melber is joining me now. Also joining us is Anthony Pappas with the Drug Policy Alliance. Anthony spent a dozen years in a state prison for a nonviolent drug offense and is now an advocate against the so-called war on drugs. So, guys, it's good to have you here. First to you, Ari, can you explain just how significant this would be if this gets signed into law?
If this were signed into law, as you just mentioned, it would be, Alex, one of the largest changes to federal prison enforcement and sentencing in a generation, especially, as we know, in a period where we've seen the war on drugs rely on these harsh sentences for drug sentencing throughout the system. I want to bring in Anthony Pappas, who's here. We've spoken to policymakers today about this. We're speaking to you as someone who's been through it in New York. Tell us about your story.
Well, I was a first-time nonviolent offender. In 1985, made the biggest mistake of my life. Got involved with drug activity. I passed an envelope with 4.5 ounces of cocaine to undercover officers for the sum of $500. For that, I made every mistake you can make, and I wound up going to prison. I was sentenced to 15 years to life. While in prison, I didn't...
Now, on that point, so was that your first offense?
First time nonviolent drug offense.
So you're really an
before.
example of what people talk about in this, where your first time in the criminal justice system, no gun, no violence,
Nothing.
right? And you got 15 to life.
Yes, 15 to life. It was a nightmare experience for me. And while I was in prison, I took advantage of the rehabilitative programs, got 3 college degrees, discovered my talent as an artist. One night I was sitting in my cell, picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror, saw an individual who's going to spend the most productive years of life in a cage, painted the self-portrait, 15 to life. 7 years later, wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art. I got a lot of publicity on my case. I came out. But that's when the story begins, because then I wanted to save those left behind, so I started being an advocate against the strict mandatory minimum sentencing laws.
And your case changed in part because George Pataki, the governor of New York, did intervene, right?
Right, he granted me executive clemency.
He was considered a moderate Republican. I want to play some sound from a conservative Republican we interviewed just this morning who's also backing this bill, Senator Mike Lee. Let's listen to that.
Certainly one can point to the fact that it costs about $30,000 a year to put somebody in federal prison, and that is a consideration. But, it's my view and the view of most of the people working on the bill that the biggest costs that we're worried about here are not just the financial ones, but the human costs. The fact that we've got husbands and fathers and uncles and nephews and husbands who are locked up sometimes for years or even decades at a time. In many instances, locked up much longer than they need to be locked up in order to protect the public and serve the interest of justice.
What does it mean to you to hear a Tea Party Republican there talking about kind of your situation, family members locked away for what he says is too long?
I think it's fantastic. I think it's a first good step. We need more to be done. But to do away with mandatory minimum sentencing, it's a great move. It's going to save a lot of lives, people returning to society who are ready to return as citizens.
And the last thing I just want to ask you briefly is, what do you say to young people who look at your story, or people who don't have hope and are worried about all these problems? What do you say with everything you've been through?
I say people make mistakes in their lives and they need second chances. So President Obama, my hat is off to him for trying to do away with mass incarceration, and I hope people follow the steps that are going to reform these laws and help people to come home to return to their families.
Right, which you were able to do, but after a long struggle and journey. Anthony Pappas, thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much.
Back to you.
Yeah, you know what I like about that? Look at Anthony. He went and got a college education a couple of times over. I mean, good for you for doing the most you could during your time there in prison. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for that discussion.
The president is doing something no other sitting president has done before. He will visit a federal prison. It's a medium security correctional facility just outside of Oklahoma City. In addition to taking a tour, the president is also expected to meet with inmates and law enforcement officials. And this comes just days after a decision by the White House to commute the prison sentences of dozens of drug offenders. Reforming the criminal justice system is something the president says he wants to make a top priority during his remaining time in office. With me now to talk about all of this, the author of 15 to Life, How I Painted My Way to Freedom, Anthony Pappas. He was locked up after being busted for delivering an envelope containing 4 ounces of cocaine worth about $500. He served 12 years, and his sentence was eventually granted executive clemency by then Governor George Pataki. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me here.
So briefly touch on your story. You're busted for carrying $500 worth of cocaine, and you're sentenced to how long?
Well, I got 2 15 to life terms. First time nonviolent drug offender under the Rockefeller drug laws of New York State, which mandate mandatory minimum sentencing laws, something that the president wants to reform. And I think it's a great idea because many, many people are in prison serving 15, 20, 25 years for small amounts of drugs, and they're rotting away in the system.
Now, were you going to sell the drugs, take the drugs?
I was a courier. I passed an envelope. It was first time nonviolent drug offender. Basically, took the envelope from the Bronx to Mount Vernon, walked into a police sting operation. 20 undercovers came out of nowhere, placed me under arrest. I did everything I could do wrong, and I wound up being sentenced to 2 15-year-to-life terms.
So you spent 12 years in Sing Sing?
Sing Sing, yes. And the only way I got out is by Governor George Pataki of New York State granted me executive clemency based on my art. One night I was sitting in my cell after 3 years, picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror, saw that an individual was going to spend the most productive years of his life in a cage, picked up a canvas and I painted the self-portrait, 15 to Life, I named it, and it wound up at the Whitney Museum of American Art a couple of years later, and I got a lot of publicity on my case, and that's how the governor found out about my case, and he granted me executive clemency.
That's amazing. So tell our viewers why you did not deserve to be in prison for 15 years to life sentences for kind of being the middleman and carrying $500 worth of cocaine.
Well, I think that, you know, maybe I deserve some type of time, but not 15 years. It was an unbelievable nightmare experience for me. I think that by Obama, President Obama now granting these clemencies to these nonviolent drug offenders, it shows an emphasis on how the system is broken, where people are placed in prison for many, many years for nonviolent drug crimes. It's a waste of human life, a waste of valuable tax dollars that could be better spent for needy communities to put shoes on shoeless children. So I think that President Obama is doing the right thing, and hopefully he'll fix this broken system.
You were like a tiny, teeny little fish, right? Right?
Tiny.
Right.
Guppy. A guppy.
You're a guppy, okay. And I'm just going to because the Washington Post has some interesting statistics that kind of illustrate what you just said. Since 1980, the prison population has more than quadrupled. To put that into perspective, that means 1 out of every 100 adults is locked up. And take a look at these other numbers too. The average cost for an inmate at a minimum security facility is about $21,000 per year. The average cost per year as a maximum security facility is about $33,000. So when you put it in economic terms like that, you can see that you're right, that we're spending all of this money incarcerating people that's not going to win the drug war, right?
Right.
What should have been done? What should your punishment have been? What could have helped you more than being locked away for 12 years?
Well, I think maybe a probation, I needed a wake-up call, not to be thrown in a cage for 15 years. I think that many Americans make mistakes in their life, and they wind up in prison, and they need second chances. I think the president is right to give an opportunity to individuals that have made mistakes in their life, and they need a second chance, a chance to be reunited with their families and to become productive taxpaying citizens. I'm hoping that governors of states follow the lead of President Obama and use their clemency pardon powers more to release people. There's one case in Louisiana, a case of Bernard Noble, a Louisiana man doing 13 years for the possession of 2 joints. So this is a crazy system. It needs to be fixed.
Anthony Pappas, thank you so much for being with me this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
President Obama has set a record for granting the most presidential pardons in a single day. Jennifer Lammers is in the newsroom with who is on this list. Jen.
Derry, yes, 78 people. That's the most of any president, bringing Obama's total number of pardons while in office to 148. He also shortened the sentences of 153 others today. As he's done throughout his entire presidency, Obama mainly focused on convicts who have been brought up on nonviolent drug charges. The idea, of course, to lessen the load in the prison system, but not everyone is on board.
In 1985, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I got involved with drug activity.
More than 20 years ago, cash-strapped and under the promise of making a quick profit, Anthony Pappas agreed to run 4.5 ounces of cocaine to someone he'd never met.
So like a carrot dangling on a string, I did it. I brought the envelope up. I walked into a police sting operation. 20 cops came out of nowhere. I was placed under arrest, and my life was over as I knew it.
Pappas' sentence, 15 years to life, and he served 12 of those years at Sing Sing, earning a degree, working in the prison library, until he got a pardon from then-Governor George Pataki. Pappas is what some have called the human face of an inhumane system, today advocating with the Drug Alliance against mass incarceration.
There's 2.2 million people locked up in the United States. over 100,000 in the federal system alone, mostly nonviolent drug offenders.
Pointing to a prison boom that began at the height of the drug war, President Obama has accelerated his pardon privileges to rapid-fire speed during his last few months in office. Critics, like New York City Councilman Joe Borelli, say while clemency for nonviolent drug charges makes sense, what about the others?
Unfortunately, the majority of the people that President Obama has pardoned are not. These are people that were convicted of trafficking, cooking, and dealing in some of the worst controlled one substances we have. You know, these are the people who are profiteering off horrible controlled substances, and I'm not sure why we would choose now to go soft on them.
There has perhaps been no stronger critic than President-elect Donald Trump. Back in October, during another wave of pardons, he slammed President Obama from the campaign trail, warning voters their safety could be at risk if the president continues to release prisoners ahead of schedule.
And according to the American Civil Liberties Union, the United States comprises just 5% of the world population, but is home to 25% of the world's prison population, making America the world's largest jailer. U.S. President Barack Obama is trying to change that statistic by using his executive clemency power to commute the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders. For decades, mandatory minimum laws have bloated U.S. prisons. In his book, 15 to Life, How I Painted My Way to Freedom, Anthony Pappas describes how discovering art while in prison changed his life and led to his clemency. He is also the media relations manager for the Drug Policy Alliance, who supports the president's decision, and he's right here in our New York studios. Anthony, nice to meet you, and welcome to Arise America.
Thank you for having me on.
So glad to have you here. I guess the first question to ask is, what's your reaction to these announced plans by Attorney General Eric Holder and President Obama to extend this clemency to a greater population in federal prisons?
It's a very welcome move, and I hope it helps to right the wrongs of a broken criminal justice system.
And what do you mean by a broken system?
Well, the mandatory minimum sentencing, which the war on drugs dictates, has found a way to break the system by incarcerating many low-level nonviolent drug offenders. So this move by President Obama shows he's concerned of the injustice that was dished out in other administrations, and he's trying to fix a broken system.
And the reality here, though, this really only deals with federal prisons, doesn't deal with states. So what's your hope there that this might perhaps set a trend?
Right, and we're hoping that because President Obama has stepped up to the plate, that governors of states will follow and exercise their clemency powers to use them more to grant people their freedom.
And the reality is, and we don't have time to go through all of these recommendations, the guidelines for clemency, but it has to do with inmates that have served at least 10 years.
Right.
If I believe they have to have, it has to be a nonviolent offense, and so it's a very focused and very narrow group that this applies to. Do you feel like they went far enough with this effort?
Well, I think for the point they're trying to make, you know, they did go far in regards to granting clemency to hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Maybe they're trying the waters out, the first steps, and maybe they'll extend it to a different population when these people come out and they see that they effectively interact with society and become tax-paying citizens and productive citizens. Maybe it'll extend to a further population and affect more people.
And if you will, Anthony, make the argument for the motivation for it extending to a wider population, because I think politically, a lot of politicians, elected officials are very reluctant. Everybody harkens back to Michael Dukakis and Willie Horton, which derailed his political career. And that is the fear of letting someone out of incarceration and then they go out and do something harmful in society.
Well, I'll use myself for an example. I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender. I was sentenced to 2 15 to life sentences under the Rockefeller drug laws of New York State, which mandate mandatory minimum sentencing. The judge, in my case, didn't want to sentence me to 15 to life, but he had to because of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And I think that there's many people stuck in prison that have fell through the cracks of the criminal justice system with no relief other than getting clemency or from the President of the United States or governors of the states they're in. So There are many men and women that deserve second chances in their life, and they're really they're fully rehabilitated, but they're stuck in prison with no alternatives.
Before I let you go, I want to get you to react to the Smarter Sentencing Act, which is being reviewed by the Senate Judiciary Committee, which would be something beyond what the president can do with his executive powers. Tell me what you think about it.
Well, I think it's great bipartisan legislation. I think it goes far in regards to giving the judges the power to look at the totality of facts and cases. It overthrows mandatory minimum sentencing, and the crack cocaine disparity in 2010 that Obama signed into legislation, which let thousands of people go. About 5,000 or 6,000 people are still stuck there. So this would, if applied, would apply retroactively and help those people get out also. So all around, it's a great piece of legislation, and hopefully it's going to pass. And I pray President Obama grants these people those clemencies and they return home to their families and reunite with their loved ones.
Anthony Pappas, thank you very much for coming on. Congratulations on all your success.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
And this is Arise America.
Anthony Pappas, you may remember his name. We've had him on this program before, and he's one of the most outspoken voices in the chorus of those hoping to reform the Rockefeller drug laws. He says an offer to make a quick $500 turned into a 15-year-to-life sentence in Sing Sing. He contemplated suicide but found hope in painting. Now, when Pappas' artwork was displayed at the Whitney Museum, the media attention poured in, and then Governor Pataki took notice. After serving 12 years of his sentence, he was granted clemency by Pataki. Anthony Pappas, he is author of 15 Years to Life, and he joins us now out of our New York City studio. Anthony, good talking to you as always.
Hey, Richard. Thanks for having me on the show.
You know, we've gone into all the reasons as to why unfair it didn't get the kingpins. Even some of the founders of this thing say it didn't turn out the way they thought, not a good use of taxpayer dollars. I can go on and on. I've spoken to a lot of DAs who say, Rich, you're missing the fact. The fact of the matter is, deal with a lot of people. It's a fraction of the people you think actually go in under Rockefeller drug laws. And if we didn't have this thing, we couldn't plea bargain with real bad guys to get deals. We need this to keep bad guys off the street. When you hear that argument, what's your answer?
These laws are ineffective. They waste tax dollars. We want to try to shift the focus in New York State from a criminal justice approach to a public health approach. Today, on the 35th anniversary, it was a historic meeting took place today where 6 assembly committees met for the first time trying to work on this approach, trying to create a way of saving lives, of saving communities through drug treatment and what accompanies drug treatment, and stop the full incarceration of people who made mistakes, treat it as a medical problem instead of a criminal problem.
I got you, Anthony. It has some judicial discretion. If somebody on a bench and they heard your story, they said, a guy like you shouldn't do 15 to life for that. But again, these DAs say, listen, Pappas the exception, not the rule. Most of these guys are dealers. They're bad guys. What kind of message are you sending if you're in some creep peddling drugs to kids, etc., and you're not going to give them a mandatory sentence? I need this thing for leverage when I'm working out a plea.
Well, look, major kingpins, and by the way, as I said before on your show, I've never seen one in prison under Rockefeller drug laws. I've never seen a kingpin. They're saying that they capture them. I never saw one in prison, and I helped dealt with hundreds of cases. I was a jailhouse attorney for many years. This is the argument they're making. You let these people out, you open the floodgates, all these bad apples will be coming out in the street. This is not the case. Most people incarcerated under Rockefeller drug laws are not first-time nonviolent offenders. 80 are nonviolent. So district attorneys are afraid of losing their powers. This is why they're making this statement. If the way it works now, they control the outcome of the case from the beginning. They control who goes into treatment. They control what people are sentenced with. So if you take that power away from them and give it to judges, they're afraid they're going to lose their power. And they live and die by their rates of conviction. That's another reason why they're saying that.
You know, I know we said that the Assembly meeting today, an important meeting, but I had Pataki tell me when he was running for re-election that he was going to change it, the Rockefeller drug laws. I've had every single politician tell me over the years, Anthony, it'll be different when you put me in office. Why aren't we going to be having the same conversation on the 40th anniversary? It sounds like a broken record.
Well, you know, right now we have some hope, real hope, with Governor Patterson, who, when he was senator, actually got with us a couple of years back, protesting in front of Governor Pataki's New York office. So I think from his background, his history, he was a senator that came from Harlem. His Senate district was heavily affected by people incarcerated under the Rockefeller drug laws, over 90% black and Latino. I think he's going to really do something and jump into action, and I think that's what's going to make the difference now. Incarcerating people is not the way to do it. You destroy lives, you waste money. It's a horrible cycle, like you said. You've heard it from many politicians. We're hoping that Governor Patterson comes to the forefront with this issue soon.
You know, when you said a governor getting arrested in New York, lately that's got different meetings, but in this one it's a good thing. So,
Yeah.
Hey, Anthony, I wish you the best of luck on this one. I know you've been standing with this issue, obviously, personally, and then since you got out. Hopefully we'll have something to report for a change on it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And go to our website, Drug Policy, to find more about this issue. Thank you.
Good enough. All right, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We have a gentleman up in New York who spent 12 years in prison. I will have to give him credit for that. While he was there, he did obtain 3 college degrees. He is a, well, matter of fact, well-known painter up in the New York area, and he has accomplished a lot. And so therefore, there may be some proof in the pudding, as we say down here, about rehabilitation. And, you know, I disagree with it, but there's a lot of people who disagree with me as well. You know, down in this area, down south, as you probably read and know, it's pretty difficult to convince people that people should go to college while in prison.
Sheriff,
it's not going to happen.
Same people
it's not going to happen.
Enter society. They're going to be your neighbors. Don't you want
okay,
somebody to come out in society
2,000
and be a productive citizen?
I think you had 2,000.
Do you want to keep them in prison? You know why, Sheriff?
Right.
Because you're down with the prison industrial complex.
Okay.
Misery, pain and misery at
yeah, right.
state, local,
okay. You had.
federal
Okay.
levels.
Let me ask.
Prison is a separate, often violent society only glimpsed by the public through the movies and television programs like HBO's Oz.
We go through cycles in this country with what the point of a prison is. Is it redemption? Is it retribution? And now we seem to have fallen back into the bigger prisons, shove everybody in there, get everybody you can off the street.
When I went inside and I saw the violence, the everyday events of imprisonment, the life, I had my share of fighting inside. And I was lucky it never escalated to, you know, stabbing anybody or something like that.
I don't know how I would survive. I don't think I would survive in prison. I don't think I have the capacity to do it.
It's a school where, you have to learn how to survive.
You see, that's the great sadness of it all, is to be able to survive in prison takes an extraordinary kind of a person, so that when they get out, we've created this strong but demented kind of a personality.
Like people say to me, well, you're an exception to the rule. And I explained to them, I might have been an exception to the rule, but being inside, even if you weren't a bad person, eventually you're going to become a bad person.
And a lot of the people that were imprisoned in the 80s are getting out now. So we are now going to reap the harvest of the mentality of just shove everybody in prison for 20 years and the problem will go away. It's such a wrong-headed approach to a terrible problem.
And Larry Goldfarb, they got me the Whitney Museum of American Art Monday.
Let me bring Andrew in, because this is wrong that it's happenstance. You know, the certain case goes to the Innocence Project, and somebody gets out from death row based on DNA. Accidents by mistakes, not deliberate. What's going on with the Rockefeller drug laws?
Well, Catherine, I think we've talked about this for years now, but Tony's story really brings it to life. And it's a larger question. What should our policy be for drug offenders, nonviolent drug offenders, people who get tied up and make a mistake? Tony doesn't say...
Nonviolent
drug offenders. Tony doesn't say he didn't commit a crime. He says, I did commit a crime. But the punishment doesn't fit the crime. And we came up with these laws here in New York 30 years ago under Governor Rockefeller, the Governor Rockefeller laws. They were an overreaction at the time. People were afraid of heroin. And they came up with the harshest laws in the nation. And the thought was, well, if you scare people with prison, they'll stop drug use. We've learned now over 31 years that doesn't work. And the laws haven't changed to fit the time. All we're asking is look at these laws in New York, which are the worst, but think about it nationwide. If you're trying to stop drug use, if you're trying to stop low-level offenders who get caught up in this, should you really send them away for 15 to life?
And be selfish just a moment. What would it cost to keep Tony locked up for 15 years?
Tony Pappas did 12 years, by the way. You think of the human cost. You had this talent in a cage when it should have been
$30,000 a year, maybe?
I bet you it cost $500,000 to keep Tony Pappas in jail for 12 years. And for what? And for what? If the judges had the discretion, which they don't now in New York, it has to be mandatory minimum 15 to life. But if a judge had discretion who could actually look at the circumstances at the time and make a determination.
Let the punishment fit the crime,
That's right.
possibly?
And send the person to treatment, which, by the way, is 15 times more effective and about half the cost, you'd have a totally different system and a more effective system.
Yeah, a lot of judges, and Judge Mark's somebody that we know who has worked very, very hard for all of this. A lot of judges are saying, please, give us back sentencing authority.
Yeah, well, the way the laws are geared, they take the discretion of the judges to look at the totality of facts. The judge in my case, Carmine Marasco, Westchester Court, didn't want to sentence me to 15 years to life, but he was handcuffed. He had to sentence me to those laws. So this memoir is a perfect example about what the reality is of going to prison, and I hope people read it. It's available on Amazon. You can see it on my website, 15tolife.com, and I hope it promotes change in this.
Well, you know, I will keep talking about it, and
I appreciate that.
It's just fabulous, fabulous. Great to see you again, and Andrew,
Thanks
keep
so
up
much.
the wonderful work.
Thanks so much.
Okay, Andrew Cuomo, Tony Pappas.
Ex-cons on the stage, Frank and Anthony, who talked about while they were in jail doing their time in prison, that they got educated, they rehabilitated themselves, they got degrees, they learned how to be back in society.
I have a question for Anthony. You stated you received, I believe, 3 degrees, and that was paid for by our tax-paying money?
To what?
They were. I have a 19-year-old, and I'm paying through the nose. And, I mean, I could see you maybe getting a GED or something, but
Well, maybe
3
you
degrees...
should send them to prison. Maybe they can get
Well, that's what it is. You commit,
the whole point is
you commit a crime, and you commit a crime...
Society is caught up in this punitive system of
You
justice
commit a crime,
that
and you
doesn't
get
think
rewarded.
of the future of the incarcerated individual, the same individual that has to return
and
to
you
society.
get rewarded,
okay?
and we pay
I'm
for
a better
it twice.
person now than I was 10
Sure
years
you are.
ago.
You're going to make a lot of money by
I
a
took
crime.
advantage of fully rehabilitated myself in any way I could.
Mark, jump in here, please.
No, I congratulate you for turning your life around, but she's right. You know, in order to get a good education, good health care, you have to go to jail today, and that's wrong. What happened to the victims of the crime?
Yeah, and you know
happened
why?
to the
You know why these bad laws exist? Because of politicians like this that create bad laws, and they don't want to change them because they don't want to look soft, and all of a sudden, you have bad laws. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
I don't think they sound soft today.
I believe that Mr. Pappas definitely turned himself around, and he seems like he's going in the right direction. He got the education in prison, is that correct?
Mr. Pappas? Yes, I got 3 college degrees while I was in prison.
Okay, I mean, that's a tremendous advantage to an individual. I don't believe you paid for that education, did you?
Oh, the taxpayer paid for 2 out of 3 degrees.
Yeah, see, I mean, I paid a lot of money for my education. I'm sure it took me longer than it probably took you, and I just don't think that's a good issue. I mean, I'm still paying my college tuition off, and you got a free ride.
I didn't get a free ride. I spent 12 years in a cage like an animal, and I did everything I could to rehabilitate myself in the best way, and I took advantage of education. It was there and I took it. I'm a better person now than I was 12 years ago, and I think this caller makes the point I want to make. There are walls of silence that are built around the prisons of the United States. And these walls, in turn, build barriers that blind the public from the truth about the prison experience. And I think this is a perfect example. There's been surveys that said that education reduces the rate of recidivism. Now, wouldn't it make common sense to give somebody an education in prison, that person return to society and be a contributing citizen in a positive way?
Let me ask Jim Gondels about.
So one of the powers that the governor of New York has is the ability to grant clemency or pardons to prisoners. Over the years, many people have seen their sentences reduced, most of them victims of the stiff Rockefeller drug laws. One of those individuals was Anthony Pappas, who in his book 15 to Life writes that he was offered a chance to make a quick $500 for delivering an envelope, but he ended up getting busted as part of a sting operation. It was his first offense, yet he had a sentence of 15 years in Sing Sing prison. After 12 years, Pappas was granted clemency by Governor George Pataki, and now he's writing to Governor Cuomo to ask him to show some leniency in his first year in office. Tony Pappas is joining us from New York City. Tony, it is great to see you. You are now the manager of media relations for the Drug Policy Alliance, right? Thanks for your time.
Right. Right, Liz. Nice seeing you. Nice talking to you again.
Okay, so if you would just please explain the difference between what you got was an executive clemency. There's a difference between clemency and pardon, right? I think it's a little confusing.
It is confusing, but to make it easy for the audience, when I got executive clemency, basically what it did is it sped up the point of release where I automatically was eligible for parole. It deals with, in regards to the differences in the relief of punishment. Let's put it like that, between pardons and clemencies.
But in terms of a record, if you get a pardon, does your record no longer exist?
It no longer exists.
Okay, but with clemency, your record still does exist.
Definitely. As a matter of fact, if I would have messed up, I would have went back to prison and would have to serve the additional time plus the time I owed.
Oh, wow. It also, is the parole board is not required to accept the clemency recommendation from the governor?
No, he's not. No, he's not. There have been cases where clemency was granted by the governor. Matter of fact, there was a famous case back a couple of years, many years ago, with Mario Como granted clemency to someone, and it took that individual 3 years to get out of prison.
Okay, so it's not a get out of jail free card, you just hand it over and walk. It doesn't work that way.
No, it's up to the parole board. They have to give their okay to let you out.
Okay, so what we're talking about here is mostly drug offenses, right? Now, Rockefeller drug laws are very draconian. They date back to the 1970s, but they were actually modified, reformed, with the highest sentences of life dropped. Am I right about that?
Yes, it was reduced. There's three changes, actually: 2004, 2005, and 2009. And these changes reduced the sentencing from a 15 to life sentence in 2004 to 8 to 20 years for A1 felons. But the point I wanted to bring out tonight, while I have the opportunity, is that many of these people who got these opportunities for sentence reduction, out of those changes, maybe 900 were resentenced under the new RDLs.
Right.
Many A1 felons, in fact, about 500 from 6 years ago existed. 415 were granted some type of relief in resentencing. That doesn't mean they got out. They just had their sentence reduced.
Yep.
But my point is that many of them are still in prison, rotting away, because of procedural bars that were made when these laws were enacted. One case in particular, Anthony Williams, he did 19 years. We fought for many years to get him out. He got a 25 to life sentence in Albany for 2 ounces of cocaine. He brought it up to Albany. It was no violence involved, but because of these tightly knit group of rogue judges in upstate New York, who don't like people bringing drugs from the inner cities up to the upstate New York, they throw the book at him.
Okay.
25, 30 year sentences.
Okay.
So he lingered for years with that sentence until he finally got some relief. It cost the state of New York millions and millions of dollars to keep him in prison.
Tony, hold on for a second. Hold on. Just two things here. First of all, the reason why I brought up the Rockefeller drug laws, which mandated long sentences for very small amounts of drugs, of narcotics we're talking about, and even though, for example, you had a first offense, you had to go away for a certain amount of time. Andrew Cuomo, when he was, before he was even State Attorney General, was an advocate for reform of these drug laws, along with Russell Simmons, for example, another prominent.
Yeah, he worked with me every day.
Yeah.
Back then. Yeah.
Yeah. So now that he has this opportunity to maybe let people out, it's unclear if he's actually going to exercise that, because of course as governor you brought up this idea of people upstate who are more conservative, judges who don't like drugs coming up the thruway, for example. You have all these different constituencies you have to appease as governor. You're not on the outside anymore saying reform, reform.
I hear you, but the thing is, there are many people who deserve second chances, who've been in prison 15, 20 years, who fell through the cracks of the criminal justice system, who are not eligible for reforms because of procedural bars created by the district attorneys. By the time somebody goes for relief, they can't get it. This one example of a case I talked about, the kid smoked a marijuana cigarette, and the judge was procedurally barred for even addressing the case, and he had to spend 5 more additional years in prison. It cost the taxpayers a conservative estimated amount, $250,000 to keep him in prison for those 5 years. So how many people like that are lingering in prison? It's not cost efficient. It costs the state millions and millions of dollars to keep these individuals here. I'm asking Andrew Cuomo, like I do every governor, sitting governor, that at Christmas time, I write them to remind them to please try to use their powers of executive clemency. I was just recently on a panel discussion at the New School. Governor Bob Kerry was there. He moderated. He's actually putting together a group of ex-governors to try to influence sitting governors to use the powers of clemency and pardons more often. But Governor Ehrlich spoke. He's the governor of Maryland, former governor of Maryland, and in 4 years he granted 249 pardons, which is an astronomical amount. But for him, he said it was about the way he felt when people thanked him about restoring their lives,
Tony,
about restoration. Yes.
I'm sorry, we're almost out of time. I just want to say very quickly, we don't know yet what Andrew Cuomo is going to do. He has up until the end of the year. But, you know, in the past, there have been governors who didn't give any clemency or pardons at all. It's not a surprise if he does nothing.
Well, you know, Governor Spitzer did that. People, advocates, right away labeled him Ebenezer Scrooge before the Ghost of Christmas came. You know, I would say this. Like Governor Eldridge, who gave 249 pardons, just look at the issue of restoration, restoring people's lives to reuniting them with their families, people who are fully rehabilitated but stuck because of the Rockefeller drug laws. They fell through the cracks of criminal justice. I'm asking the Governor Cuomo to please address these cases. He gets hundreds of requests, 300 to 400 a year. This is his first year in office. I asked him to please take off his governorship hat in the holiday season and just look at the facts and please grant some people some clemency.
Tony, we will see. Obviously, we'll be following this one because it is something that we look for at the end of the year. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I really want to thank you for your time this evening, for making yourself available, and happy holidays.
Thanks so much. Happy holidays to everyone.
Anthony Pappas spent 12 years in prison for attempting to deliver 125 grams of cocaine, his first and only try. His profit would have been $500. Although he discovered his talent for art behind bars, others suffered.
Well, I was married. I had a 7-year-old daughter. It just ruined their lives because prison doesn't stop at the prison wall. It goes beyond the wall.
Papa says it costs billions of taxpayer dollars to keep drug offenders behind bars.
That money could be better spent for keeping schools open, feeding needy children, helping needy communities.
Drugs can be deadly both to those who use them and those fighting the trade. In Mexico, there have been at least 47,000 drug-related killings over the past 6 years. Brazil and Colombia are also racked by drug violence. Former U.S. Presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, whose administrations funded the war on drugs at home and abroad, now say the approach is flawed. President Clinton.
We could have fighting and killing over cigarettes if we made it a felony to sell a cigarette or smoke one. So we legalized it. If all you do is try to find a police or military solution to the problem, a lot of people die and it doesn't solve the problem.
The former presidents of Brazil and Switzerland, Fernando Cardoso and Ruth Dreyfus, and Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos, want to find different ways to solve the global drug problem, such as regulating the trade.
I think a new approach, or at least to try to open up, to break the taboo, is what the world should do. There are many alternatives, including the possibility of legalizing drugs.
A documentary titled Breaking the Taboo, which focuses on failures in the war on drugs, recently premiered in New York City. Executive producer Sam Branson condemns drugs, but not drug users.
Instead of throwing them in jail, maybe make them see a doctor. Maybe they need some help. A lot of people who take drugs aren't committing crimes specifically, they're just lost in life.
But many disagree with decriminalization for both medical and law enforcement reasons. Former Republican Congressman Jim Colby says most U.S. lawmakers oppose legalization.
We want tougher penalties for drug users, and particularly for people who sell and traffic in the drugs. We want to maintain the long terms, the prison terms and penalties that are there.
Anthony Pappas notes that illegal drugs are available even in prisons and questions how they can be controlled in a free society if they can't be controlled behind bars. Peter Fedinsky, VOA News, New York.
Tony Pappas, who served 12 years in prison for a first-time nonviolent drug offense, said it's pastime. Addiction is treated as a medical problem, not a crime.
People should not be put away in prison for many, many years for putting substances in their bodies. That's not the answer. My name is Anthony Pappas. This is my art installation called The Drug War. I'm artist in residence for the Drug Policy Alliance. I was a first-time nonviolent drug offender that was sentenced to 2 15-year-to-life sentences under the Rockefeller drug laws. The way I got out of prison was through my art. In 1988, one night I was sitting in my cell, picked up a mirror, looked in the mirror, saw an individual who's going to spend the most productive years of life in a cage, and I painted a self-portrait, which appeared at the Whitney Museum of American Art 7 years later. I got a lot of publicity on my case, and Governor George Pataki granted me executive clemency. So I used my art as a vehicle to get awareness about the issue of the drug war in the United States. I wanted to save those I left behind.
Horrible prisons and harsh sentences for convicts inspired Hugo to write Les Miserables. Ideas for reform were once popular in the United States, but lost favor in recent decades. Today, almost 2 million people in America live behind bars. Lengthy minimum prison terms are common and devastating, especially to first-time offenders like Anthony Pappas.
Sitting in my cell one night, I looked in the mirror and I saw this man, and I knew that this individual was going to spend the most productive years of his life in a cage. And so what I did is I picked up a canvas and a mirror and I painted the self-portrait.
In 1985, Anthony Pappas ran a small radio repair shop in New York City. Business was slow. He was having difficulty supporting his wife and child.
At first I said no, because I knew what it was about. I knew that this guy was a drug dealer. And a couple of months went by, and it was near Christmas time, and I was really doing bad. So the guy approached me again, and basically, I said, well, what do I have to do? He said, well, if you bring this envelope to Westchester County in Mount Vernon, New York, you'll make $500. Through a series of events, I went to trial, I was convicted, and I was sentenced to 15 years to life.
Although Anthony Pappas was a first-time nonviolent offender, he received the mandatory minimum sentence in New York State, 15 years to life. Like 22,000 other drug offenders in New York, Anthony was ineligible for parole for 15 years.
I know plenty of men and women that are inside that have made mistakes and deserve a chance to return to society. But they're stuck there because of mandatory minimum sentencing.
Anthony spent 12 years in prison before he was granted clemency by the governor. In that time, he lost his family, discovered his talent, and earned 3 degrees. Today, he is rehabilitated, but like Valjean, burdened with the label ex-convict.
There's still people that look at me cross-eyed. My firm where I work, or people that don't want to be associated with me, or people, when they find out about who I am, all of a sudden they look at me different. But the stigma is definitely there. I'll wear it for the rest of my life. My name is Anthony Pappas. I spent 12 years in prison under the Rockefeller drug laws. When I was a young man, I made a mistake. It was the only time I got in trouble with the law. 12 years in a 6 by 9 foot cage. These laws waste money, destroy lives, and break up families. Governor Pataki's plan to change these laws is not true reform, and he knows it. After 8 years of talk, it's time for a change. Tom Golisano's plan is true reform, and that's why I'm supporting him.
Want to play the soundbite? Get your reaction on the other side.
He signed a drug bill, which is one of the worst drug bills I've ever seen in my life. I voted against it. It's a bill that unfortunately is going to let out a lot of drug dealers and other people. But I personally think it was a huge mistake, and it'll come back to haunt us. It'll come back to haunt New York City, and it'll come back to haunt Buffalo.
Tony, how could you assuage the fears of people who believe what the senator clearly does believe?
Well, listen, Senator Dale Volcker is a buddy of mine for years. He's been an advocate for not changing these drug laws. And the reason is because he has 6, 7, 8 prisons in his district. And, you know, those prisons are full with people from inner city neighborhoods like the one I came from. And they keep the prisons full and they feed the community. That's why people like him don't want the Rockefeller drug laws to change, because these laws feed their community through the imprisonment of low-level, non-violent drug offenders. So for Dale Volcker, look, Senator, I'm sorry. Go with the flow. Work with us now, and let's try to walk on common ground to make these laws work, where everybody, citizens, become safe. People who are incarcerated can come out early, committed crimes. Maybe they have substance abuse problems. They don't belong in prison for many, many years. So you could keep the prisons full. That's not the way it's supposed to work.
But again, these DAs say, listen, Pappas the exception, not the rule. Most of these guys are dealers. They're bad guys. What kind of message are you sending if you're in some creep peddling drugs to kids, etc., and you're not going to give them a mandatory sentence? I need this thing for leverage when I'm working out a plea.
Well, look, major kingpins, and by the way, as I said before on your show, I've never seen one in prison under Rockefeller drug laws. I've never seen a kingpin. They're saying that they capture them. I never saw one in prison, and I dealt with hundreds of cases. I was a jailhouse attorney for many years. This is the argument they're making. You let these people out, you open the floodgates, all these bad apples will be coming out in the street. This is not the case. Most people incarcerated under Rockefeller drug laws are not first-time nonviolent offenders. 80% are nonviolent. So district attorneys are afraid of losing their powers. This is why they're making this statement. If the way it works now, they control the outcome of the case from the beginning. They control who goes into treatment. They control what people are sentenced with. So if you take that power away from them and give it to judges, they're afraid they're going to lose their power. And they live and die by their rates of conviction. That's another reason why they're saying that.
Anthony Pappas, convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug possession charge in 1985. How many years did you spend in jail, Anthony?
Hi, Amy. I spent 12 years of a 15 to life sentence. I was sentenced to Sing Sing prison. Eventually, I was granted clemency in 1997 by Governor George Pataki. When I got out, I made it a point to fight these laws. I joined the forces with Randy Credico and mothers that had disappeared. And basically, we've been out there since 1998, protesting against these laws, asking the governor to change them. And for the first time in the history of politics, in 2001, a governor of New York State called for reform, which was Governor Pataki. The Assembly and the Senate followed his cue, but for 2 years they've been bickering over what changes should be made. And while this bickering is going on through this political rhetoric, people are wasting away in prison and family members are giving up.
What did you actually do?
I passed an envelope of 4.5 ounces of cocaine for $500. I was set up in a sting operation in Westchester County through a friend I met in a bowling alley. I was desperate, like the carrot dangling on the string. I went for it, and I made the biggest mistake of my life. But
did you have a record?
I had no record. I was a first-time nonviolent offender, but yet I was sentenced to actually 2 15-year-to-life sentences. And the judge ran them together, and I served a sentence of 15 years to life. And the only way I got out was when I was granted clemency by Governor Pataki in 1997.
You painted in prison.
Right. I became a painter, discovered my talent as an artist, and actually I painted my way out of prison. You could actually see my work on my website at 15yearstolife.com, and you can read all about
the 15 years, like the number 15?
Right.
15 years.
To life.com, and you can see actually a representation of my life in prison, what I went through. And you can read all about the war on drugs and the mothers of New York disappeared. When I came out in 1997, I appeared on the show C-SPAN, and Randy Credico saw me on TV, and he wanted to get together and with the William Kunstler Fund for Racial Justice, wanted to do something about the war on drugs. So he followed me, tracked me down, and we decided to get together. We came up with this idea of organizing against the Rockefeller drug laws, and we created this group, which in 5 years changed the face of the war on drugs in New York State. At first, when I went to Albany, I lobbied, I talked to the politicians. They had a duo type of persona in reference to what the drug laws were about. They had the public view was totally draconian. Yeah, this is good, this is what we need. But behind doors, they said, look, we know these laws don't work, but we can't do anything about it because we'll look soft on crime and lose our seats. And because of their political careers, they wouldn't come out. But what we did is we went to the streets, took the people to the streets and protested for 5 years through rain, sleet, and snow, and convinced the public that these laws are draconian in nature. There's over 68,000 people in prison, over 18,000 are in there under the Rockefeller drug laws. 94% are black and Latino. And these are many men and women that have made mistakes in their life, but they're stuck there because of mandatory minimum sentencing. These laws are definitely terrible, draconian, strictly punitive. And there are other ways to solve problems. A lot of people are addicted to drugs. People who are marginalized, disenfranchised, get caught up in these laws. They know nothing about them, and all of a sudden it's too late. And because of mandatory sentencing, they're sentenced to 15 years to life.
He's been in the middle of this fight for reform ever since the Rockefeller drug laws literally changed his life. Anthony Pappas is the author of 15 to Life, the title matching the sentence he received after what he says was a first-time drug offense. Tony spent 12 years in Sing Sing before being granted clemency by Governor George Pataki. Since then, he's been a leading advocate for reform. His story is an inspiring one, and it's the subject of his book. In just a bit, we'll get his reaction to the reforms he has worked for so long. Great conversation coming up. Do stay tuned for it. In the meantime, and we welcome you back on this Friday night. Hope you're well as always, all across the state. Well, as we mentioned at the start of the program tonight, it's being described as the end of one of the country's most controversial laws. The governor and legislative leaders announcing an agreement today to strike down some of the last remaining remnants of New York's Rockefeller drug laws. The deal eliminates tough mandatory minimum prison sentences for most nonviolent first and second-time drug offenders and gives judges more discretion to offer treatment rather than simply send them off to jail. The Rockefeller drug laws have long been considered some of the toughest in the nation, leading its critics to say that prisons are overpopulated by mostly minorities, we're left with a drug problem that persists as law enforcement focuses on the wrong people, and a costly price tag for the taxpayer. Well, few people know that, as well as my first guest tonight. Anthony Pappas spent 12 years behind bars after what he describes as a, quote, foolish mistake. He was sentenced to 15 years to life for that first-time offense, but granted clemency by George Pataki in 1996. Pappas is also the author of 15 to Life, a book detailing his encounter with the Rockefeller drug laws and the fight he's led since being released. As you saw, Tony joins us from New York City tonight. Tony, good to have you back. Appreciate your time tonight.
Hey, great to be back.
And I imagine on this day it is particularly great to be back. Tony has mentioned you've been here a couple of times along the path to this day, though perhaps never knowing when this day might come. Give us your sense as to what kind of victory this is for you as an activist who's fought for so long now.
Well, the word vindication comes to mind. I mean, you know, I spent 12 years of a 15-to-life sentence for a first-time nonviolent offense for passing an envelope with 4.5 ounces of cocaine in 1984. I made the biggest mistake in my life, got involved with drug activity. For $500, I brought the package up from the Bronx, New York to Mount Vernon and walked into a police sting operation. 20 cops came out of nowhere, placed me under arrest. I did everything I could do wrong, and eventually I was sentenced to 15 years to life under the mandatory minimum sentencing of the Rockefeller drug laws. So I went to prison, Sing Sing prison in Austin, New York, where I spent a good number of years, most fruitful years of my life, because of my single mistake in 1984. So for me, today's a special day. I kind of really don't believe it happened yet. Like, I have to see it in the ink dry on the contract.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask you, because you have gotten so close so many times, and yet today is the first time we've had the governor joined by the two legislative leaders saying, we have agreed to a deal, and yet you're still skeptical that it might happen. Why is that?
Well, you know, listen, we went through this last time when Russell Simmons had met with the legislative leaders and Governor Pataki, a 7.5-hour marathon meeting, and you know, when it was all done, everybody came out and said, yeah, we worked the deal. And in the morning, there was no deal. So, you know, that was like the second year in a row that we got so close, yet no change occurred. I was watching the press conference today, and, you know, I had a tear in my eye. It was like, wow, this is really happening after all these years. Because when I came out in 1997, when I was granted clemency by Governor Pataki, you know, I started a group, Mothers of the New York Disappeared. We became leading activists, family members of those incarcerated. We made many trips to Albany, New York, to talk to legislative leaders and the governor. And we tried with all our heart to convince them that these laws did not work. It was a waste of tax dollars, a waste of human life. Many people that we represented with our group had medical problems. They had substance abuse problems, but they were treated strictly punitively, where they would get long sentences and wind up in prison for many years. So for me, this day is special, and I hope it does pass. I hope these laws finally changed in a meaningful way.
I want to ask you a two-part question here. Why do you think it took so long for this to happen? This fight has been being waged, in at least to some degree, for 30 years now. It's taken all this time. Why do you think it's taken this long, and why do you think now is the moment that it's changed?
Well, I think common sense finally prevailed. Politicians knew that these laws did not work for many, many years. I think because of the political climate in Albany and upstate rural communities, where many of these prisons are built. Since 1982, about 33 prisons have been built, many of them in upstate Republican territories. It became a means of living for a lot of people. So I think what has happened is that many politicians were afraid that if these prisons became empty, they would shut down, and there goes their economy.
Yeah.
I think the governor was smart enough, Governor Patterson, who was an outstanding critic of the Rockefeller drug laws when he was a senator from Harlem, New York, in a heavily affected district. Over 90% of black and Latinos are affected by these laws, are locked up under the Rockefeller drug laws. So he felt the pain. He knew what was going on because of his constituency. So I think he took the leadership role in this. And because the stars were aligned, you know, the Democrats controlled, I think it was just the right timing and everything worked out. And this is why I think the law's finally going to change.
And as we mentioned to our audience before, the governor even was arrested advocating for Rockefeller reform as a senator prior to becoming governor. Of course, now he's the man who will end up, as you say, hopefully signing that piece of legislation. But Tony, as you well know, there are critics of what happened today and what will happen as a result. You told the first half of your story, the part where you committed the crime. You didn't tell the second half, and let me tell it for you because it's extraordinary. While in prison for that dozen years, you got 2 bachelor degrees and you got a master's degree. And you also became a prolific painter. Some people might recognize your name because of your pieces of art, which are astounding by any measure. And there are those who will say, you know what, Tony, you screwed up. You call it a foolish mistake, but you committed the crime. You went to jail. You became an active citizen. You got that degree, you furthered yourself in your education. That's exactly what's supposed to happen behind bars. So you call the laws unjustly harsh. Someone might look at that and say, well, you're a case study of why they work so well.
Yeah, but I didn't need to be sentenced to 15 years to life to understand the mistake I made. It cost the taxpayers almost $600,000-700,000 to keep me in prison all those years, maybe more money than that. But it was a waste of tax dollars, a waste of human life. For myself, I committed a crime. Okay, maybe I should have did some time, but not a 15-year to life sentence. Mandatory minimum sentencing is a horrible way to go. Right now, under these new laws, most mandatory minimum sentencing disappears. Judges now have discretion. And what that means is that they could look at the totality of facts. In my case, the judge did not want to sentence me to 15 to life, but he had to because I chose to go to trial. It was a mandatory minimum sentencing. If I would have got the same kind of sentence today under these new laws, the judge could have saw my participation in the crime wasn't that great. I was not a drug dealer. I was an individual that brought an envelope up for $500, so my part was minimal. So he would have probably gave me less time or maybe even probation. And let's say if somebody has a substance abuse problem, the prisons are full with people with substance abuse problems. When I was in prison, I became a jailhouse attorney. I handled hundreds of cases. I never saw a kingpin in prison. Yeah. And most of them were low-level, nonviolent offenders, were stuck there because they had medical problems. They had substance abuse problems. So I think the trend now from dealing with these problems strictly punitive to one that would deter these people to treatment is the way to go.
Hey,
it
Tony,
will save taxpayers a lot of money.
I've just got seconds remaining, and I want to ask you, because of by virtue of what happened to you in prison, all those things that you accomplished, do you look at that dozen years of your life as lost, or do you look at them as something gained by virtue of what you did there?
Well, I look at it as I took a bad situation and made it good. You know, I became an artist. I got a couple of degrees. I work for the Drug Policy Alliance now. I'm a communication specialist. I got a great job. Actually, my book is becoming a feature film. The option was bought, so I'm hoping to tell my story on the big screen. And I think I just made a bad situation good. And this gives a point to people that maybe you're suffering in life and things aren't that good. You always look for hope and for change and never give up. And that's what I did. I never gave up. And I'm thankful for today.
No, indeed, you never gave up until today. And I don't believe for a moment that you're giving up just yet. Tony Pappas, the book is called 15 to Life. Worth a read for anyone watching here tonight. Anthony, thanks for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me on your show.